My ex-wife was about to remarry. Then she asked me one question I never expected. The invitation arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, tucked between unpaid bills and advertisements. I never bothered to read. At first, I almost threw it away. Then I noticed the familiar handwriting on the envelope. My heart froze before my hands did. Inside was a simple wedding invitation with elegant gold letters announcing that my ex-wife, Emily, was getting married in 2 weeks. I stared at the card for what felt like hours, wondering why she had sent it to me after 3 years of silence. We hadn't ended our marriage with screaming or betrayal. We had ended it with something much quieter and somehow far more painful. The slow realization that love alone could not survive years of grief, misunderstandings, and the dreams we lost together. I thought receiving that invitation would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part came when I stood in front of her on her wedding day, and she looked into my eyes before walking down the aisle and asked me one question I never expected to hear. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories that remind us all of the power of compassion. There was a time when Emily and I believed we would grow old together. We met in college while volunteering at a neighborhood food bank. She laughed with her whole heart, and I admired how she always noticed people others ignored. We married young, rented a tiny apartment with squeaky wooden floors, and dreamed about buying a house filled with children and Sunday morning breakfasts. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We celebrated small victories because we didn't have much money. Yet somehow those years remain the richest memories I have ever owned. Everything changed after we lost our first child before she was born. The grief settled into our home like thick winter fog. Neither of us knew how to comfort the other because we were both drowning in pain. Emily buried herself in work, while I spent longer hours at the office trying to avoid the silence waiting for me at home. We stopped talking about our feelings because every conversation seemed to end with tears neither of us could stop. Eventually, we became strangers sharing the same roof, pretending everything was fine until pretending became impossible. Our divorce wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors or bitter court battles. We simply signed the papers, divided our belongings, hugged one last time, and walked away carrying invisible scars that would follow us for years. Friends told us it was the mature thing to do, but maturity offered little comfort during lonely nights. I often wondered whether we had given up too soon, or whether some broken things simply couldn't be repaired. The years that followed taught me lessons I never wanted to learn. I moved into a small apartment overlooking a river where elderly couples walked every evening. Watching them reminded me of the future I once imagined. I focused on rebuilding my life, volunteered at the same food bank where Emily and I had first met, and slowly discovered that helping others eased the weight I carried inside. I wasn't searching for another relationship. I was simply trying to become someone I could respect again. When Emily's invitation arrived, old emotions returned without asking permission. I considered staying home. Why reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal? Yet something deep inside whispered that avoiding the wedding would only leave another unanswered chapter in my life. So I bought a modest suit, drove 3 hours to the small lakeside town where the ceremony would take place, and reminded myself that sometimes closure requires showing up even when it hurts. The venue overlooked a quiet lake, surrounded by towering oak trees. Families laughed, children chased one another across the grass, and soft music floated through the afternoon breeze. Everyone seemed genuinely happy for Emily. I noticed how radiant she looked from across the garden. She smiled more than I remembered, but there was still a familiar gentleness in her eyes that time had not erased. I kept to myself near the back, hoping to quietly congratulate her afterward before leaving. Instead, one of the bridesmaids approached and asked if I would come with her because Emily wanted to speak to me privately. Before the ceremony began, my pulse quickened as I followed her through a hallway, lined with family photographs and fresh flowers. Emily stood alone, beside a window overlooking the lake. For a moment, it felt as though the last 3 years had disappeared. We smiled awkwardly, unsure how two people who once knew everything about each other had become polite strangers. She thanked me for coming. I wished her happiness because I truly meant it. Then she looked at me with tears quietly forming in her eyes and asked the question that changed everything. She wanted to know whether I had ever forgiven myself. The question caught me completely off guard because I had spent years believing she blamed me for everything that happened. I never imagined she understood the guilt I carried every day. I admitted that I still replayed countless moments in my mind, wondering if I could have saved our marriage by listening more, speaking more honestly, or simply staying present during our darkest days. I confessed that losing our daughter made me feel like I had failed, both of them. Emily gently shook her head. She told me she had asked herself the same questions for years. She explained that her new relationship had only become healthy after she finally accepted that grief had defeated both of us, not because either of us stopped loving the other. She said she had invited me because she couldn't begin a new chapter, while believing I was still trapped inside the old one. Those words lifted a burden I had carried longer than I realized. For the first time since our divorce, I saw our story differently. We hadn't failed because we lacked love. We failed because we didn't know how to survive unimaginable pain together. That truth hurt, but it also brought peace. Before leaving the room, Emily reached into a small wooden box and handed me a folded letter she had written years earlier. but never mailed. She said, reading it might finally help me let go. I slipped it into my jacket pocket without opening it. Some moments deserve quiet respect. The ceremony that followed was beautiful. As Emily walked toward the man who would become her husband, I didn't feel jealousy. I felt gratitude. She deserved happiness, and surprisingly, so did I. Watching her smile reminded me that healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about carrying it with enough grace that it no longer controls your future. Later that evening, I sat alone beside the lake and opened her letter. She wrote about our happiest memories, the kindness we had shared, and how she hoped one day I would stop defining myself by the worst season of our lives. She thanked me for loving her when we were young and frightened. She apologized for the words left unsaid. Most importantly, she reminded me that our daughter, though she never took a single breath, had forever changed both of us by teaching us the depth of unconditional love. I cried harder than I had in years, but they were different tears. They weren't tears of regret. They were tears of release. Over the following months, I continued volunteering, reconnected with old friends, and eventually mentored grieving parents who were walking through losses similar to ours. I discovered that the broken parts of my life had become the very places where I could offer hope to others. Emily's unexpected question had forced me to confront the one person I had never forgiven, myself. If this story has touched your heart so far, please like this video, share it with someone who may need encouragement today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner for more emotional stories that remind us hope is never truly lost. Special request, before this story ends, please leave a comment answering one question. Have you ever forgiven someone or yourself when you thought it was impossible? Your story may inspire someone reading the comments today. As the sun disappeared behind the lake that evening, I realized life rarely gives us the endings we imagine. When we're young, sometimes love becomes friendship. Sometimes goodbye becomes gratitude. Sometimes the person who once broke your heart becomes the one who quietly helps heal it. Emily didn't ask whether I still loved her. She didn't ask whether I wished things had been different. She asked whether I had forgiven myself, because she understood that true freedom begins long before we find another relationship. It begins the moment we choose compassion over guilt and hope over regret. I drove home beneath a sky filled with stars, carrying no bitterness, no anger, and no unanswered questions. Only the quiet certainty that even after our deepest heartbreaks, life still has room for healing, kindness, and beautiful new beginnings.